Good morning. It's still good morning. Thank you very much, Mady, for the introduction, for the invitation, and it's good to be back in London. I run SynergisTech Communications. We are a documentation solutions company. Put another way, I recruit technical writers. I recruit technical writers for the API industry, typically. I come from Silicon Valley. Most of my clients currently are API developer startups. And I used to be a tech writer myself, but I also saw a lot of documentation done wrong, and I got calls for people who did documentation who could be something I was not. So I built a firm. And I used to live in this country. I'm not a total alien. I lived in this country from 70 to 80 and did common entrance and O and A levels and even an S level exam, so I'm not totally outside the set, but I don't have an English accent any longer. Let me start with my assumptions about documentation. I hope we can all agree documentation matters, as Mady just covered. It drives business. It lets companies scale by reducing the burden on all the people who typically grow the business, and it keeps companies compliant. I think we can also agree that engineers don't like to write. In fact, some of them hate it and put it off and pretend it isn't necessary. And engineers are definitely busy. So I hope we can also agree that documentation is a part of the product and needs to be tended to. And ultimately, if you're responsible about it, it can be delegated intelligently. So the right tech writer, let's define our terms. What is this person? Somebody who knows your audience, doesn't have to be instructed on what your audience needs and values, who knows your product and can perhaps even read your source code, figure things out from there, who knows your tools or can learn them very quickly without any cost to you on their own time, who knows your priorities, who understands the urgency and the depth, the clarity, the accuracy, and the style that you want, the audience's preferred style to engage and get that person adamant about implementing your product. Because ultimately, in the open source world in particular, if you are not getting an engaged audience, you're not getting business. Also understands that you're busy. Okay, so the right tech writer needs to install and use your product. A tech writer who says, gee, I'll just take dictation from you. I will let you explain to me what you want your users to know. That's not one who's going to save you time. That's not one who's going to save you money. A tech writer also needs access to your product, access to your chat channels, access to existing documentation, also perhaps even the competition's documentation. Often I ask clients, what do you want from a documentation effort? Whose products do you want to emulate? They also need consensus on the content priorities, and they need feedback. Yes, they need feedback on drafts. They need feedback on priorities. Things change in development cycles. They need to be kept apprised. Okay, the right tech writer also delivers what you need, and that's not always what everybody wants. We can discuss that in detail. They have a technical background. If they're writing software developer product documentation, they need some coding experience, even if it's only as a hobby. They need some background there. And I've also interestingly found that a music background correlates with effective documentation talent. I'd use the word documentarian, but I think that got reserved by the dictionary before the Write the Docs people invented it. So they need to communicate preemptively. They need to understand that you care about their priorities only so far as they mesh with what matters to them now, i.e. if you change the plan and the documentation people aren't in the loop, everything gets wasted. Finally, well, not finally, but most importantly, I believe, they need to write relevant and focused and accurate content. A lot of technical writers I know explain products to themselves, to audience, to a writer or a reader who knows exactly what they know. so they're explaining the product in an echo chamber. If they don't understand what your audience already knows and can write relevant content, it's not over their heads and not insultingly stupid, they're wasting your time. They basically need to operate without hand-holding, and they need to make constructive suggestions. Many opportunities to comment responsibly on the UI, on user interaction, and so forth, are essential. The tech writer sees these and needs to step up, make their point. The right API writer does not need to be told what to do, where to look, or make excuses, or frankly pretend they don't have any showable documentation. If you hear a tech writer say, but I can't show you any documentation because it's all under non-disclosure, NDA, keep looking. Okay, in Silicon Valley, where I come from, the tech writer feels a sense of startup level urgency, of entrepreneurial activity. They will jump with intensity on new priorities. They will adapt quickly when those priorities change. They will produce quickly rather than saying, I am coming up to speed, give me a couple weeks before I show you anything. If they're not producing within a couple days, at least something to show you that they're on their wavelength, again, they're wasting your time. They'll ask tough questions with the intent not of alienating you or making you angry or trying to change your agenda, but to improve efficiency, to improve the usefulness of your product. They also prefer working remotely because in Silicon Valley, at least, average commutes are 90 minutes one way. All right, so the API tech writer in Silicon Valley doesn't try to override your agenda, doesn't make excuses, doesn't resist requests to write sample code. This is something that documentation often lacks. It's the difference between good and great documentation. Okay, but even the right tech writer, the right API tech writer, can need some help. If it's a huge project, they might welcome some help from another tech writer. They certainly would benefit from having an editor because you're looking at this documentation all day long. You read what you think you wrote, but it's not always what you did. And you welcome the influence of a project manager, or even some input into the schedule. Not veto power, but some input. All right. If you don't need an API tech writer to do your documentation, you may just need a developmental editor. That's a technically sophisticated editor who is more than a style guide cop. If you are looking for a proofread, not less than a rewrite, but more than a proofread, a developmental editor is going to help you. If somebody whose English is not their first language, English is a second language, is what ESL stands for. If someone like that wrote your documentation, hire an editor and get that documentation patched, but not rewritten. And if you need code samples, be aware that people who write code samples are not equally good at writing documentation. There's a trade-off here. Most API writers' forte is not writing the code samples. They can do it, it's just less efficient. Sometimes it's delegated anyway to them, and that's fine. You just need to know that's what they're going to be having to do. Okay. Also, when I was researching the EU market, I was told they value certifications and degrees in their expertise. In Silicon Valley in particular, the state of the art is evolving so quickly, so dynamic, that there is no yet corpus of information that is gaining traction for certifications. In fact, there are very few technical writer certifications, never mind API documentation certifications. So Silicon Valley selects for technical knowledge. They could not care less, sometimes it seems to this ex-writer, about how well you write. They want to know which tools you know, which technologies you know, which audiences you've written for. Show me your API samples, show me your quick starts, show me your tutorials, and that's the basis on which I'll hire you. So the earlier speaker mentioned 3 different kinds of APIs, or 4 different kinds of APIs. From a technical writer's point of view, there are primarily 3. The internal API, in which most content is private, unexposed, and these are typical of large companies with huge products. If you can think of any that come to mind, probably will have an internal API. It's for their own reference. It keeps them sane. It keeps their operations ticking over. It does not necessarily get sold. Partnership APIs, these are typical of companies that sell. LinkedIn is another excellent example of those, where you're selling features of your overall product to different price points of customer. And then there are the open source APIs. This is where I do most of my work. And these are fully exposed, short TTFHW. Any guesses on what that means? Time to first hello world. These are typical of Stripe and Twilio, SendGrid, Box, and thousands of others. And this is where my partner, James Neiman, and I focus most of our efforts because the demand is strongest for seriously technical tech writers. Anyway, those 3 different kinds of APIs require different kinds of tech writers. The first takes a hyper-organized, what I'll call single-threaded or methodical tech writer, very focused with a more formal writing style that gets perhaps even simplified English. It's locked down English that is more easily translated and communicated across cultures. B, which is the partnership API setup, you need an organized, multi-threaded tech writer. That's someone who balances multiple plates, spins multiple plates, is more reactive, not necessarily entirely programming savvy, and writes in a more engaging, modern style, but still not conversational. And the last, the open source, fully exposed, get them hooked quickly, documentation, requires developer DNA. There's really no question there. If you're not an ex-developer, you can't have the conversation at the right level with the developers who are creating this product, and therefore you cannot speak their message. These people are focused on keeping it brief and precise and friendly to engage those on the ADD or other spectrum. These are people with no attention span. They need to be shown how to use the product in 5 minutes or less. Okay, so a little bit more about that right tech writer. These are seasoned pros who know what works and what doesn't, will save you a lot of time if you listen to them. They'll learn fast because they have a deep frame of reference. They have a lot of background, and they can leverage that pivot, and you will benefit. They're loyal. These are non-millennials. They have finished job hopping. They have little left to prove. They want the opportunity to do quality work. Mostly they are ego-free. They all have a lot of initiative. They would be dead if they didn't. And they tune into your agenda. They do not try to override yours with theirs, rather. And they land running. It's a paratrooper analogy. I'm sure you've all heard it. They're adept at performing solo. These people don't require a team. They don't require handholding. Okay, challenged. Where do you find these people? If you've not seen them recently, you're not alone. They're timid woodland creatures for the most part. They're shy. They market themselves by word of mouth. They don't really need to go out there hunting. In fact, they prefer referrals from people who they've impressed. They're not cheap, they're just worth it. They tend also to gravitate to what interests them, and that might not interest you, and that might not be relevant to you. Also, they're leery of self-destructive rescue missions where the name of the game is, we failed to plan, therefore you must pick up the pieces and make us look good regardless. And candidly, they ignore recruiters. These people get 20 calls a week from the subcontinent, and they send me email and laugh. At what they're being asked to do and what they're being offered as financial reward. Okay, So where do we really look? We really look in our network. That's where you'll find the best and most trustworthy source of referrals. That's someone says this person did good work for me under these contexts, trust that. You could also convert a developer or a technical trainer. You could advertise, but a word to the wise on the advertising front, skip the long requirements lists, those what we call in the US kitchen sink job descriptions. If you don't make this job description enticing to somebody who's got illusions of upward mobility, or at least engagement, you won't fill the job. How do I mean make it interesting? You want to offer exposure to new tools, to new API specifications perhaps. You want to offer them customer contact. The elephant in the room for most technical writers, they don't talk to customers. They don't know what the customer thinks. They don't know what the customer thinks of the documentation. They're kept at arm's length by product management and support and a few others. It's unfortunate. I hope it's changing, but those are the facts. If you offer them impact on product design, they will love you forever and stay forever, because that is very validating to a technical communicator. So I hope it goes without saying, my firm can deliver this right API tech writer. We are very experienced, 22 years worth of experience in Silicon Valley, delivering documentation solutions for technical audiences in the software development space. People who have functional programming experience, they have experience with modern API specifications and authoring tool chains, nothing phases them. They speak flawless North American business English. That often is a problem when you're writing from an Eastern European country, perhaps, or a South American country, or from the subcontinent. You're going to get localized English, and that's not going to fly with the biggest, most lucrative part of your market. You're going to get world-class documentation from US-based tech writers. Typically, these people work on contract, and they are available on a project basis, or even on a staff direct hire, salaried, full-time employment / captive basis. Also, we deliver no surprises. We vet these people from similar projects from 22 years worth of experience. And now I'd like you to meet the proof, James Neiman. James Neiman is, he is top of the pyramid. He is the gold standard for most of my clients in Silicon Valley. I have placed James nonstop for 6 years, and he's expert in particular at the startup, we have nothing but a deadline situations. Something from nothing, order from chaos. Seriously technical writer who understands the audience, who understands the product, who understands the context, who sympathizes and can get along with the culture. I'd like to bring James up and ask him some questions on your behalf and then entertain questions from you. So we'll try to make this a little entertaining. All right, this is James Neiman. All right, so, don't applaud just yet, because we're not done. All right, so James, I'm gonna go over here. What do you do when you hear, we have no doc, just a deadline?
What I do is I find out what the business needs are. The deadline is written in stone for me. What I want to know is what is it they need in order to engage their customers as soon as possible. It could be that they're trying to attract and hold new customers. That would mean that they need something that enables fast adoption, the 5-minute experience rule, 5 minutes to hello world. That's what I would call a quick start. I also would want to know what their primary use cases are and what they're rolling out for alpha, beta, GA, and beyond, so that I can prioritize the work that's most important for their business priorities at the time.
Great, thank you. tell us about one of your most impactful API doc rescue missions.
There is a company that produces video technology, audio-video communication technology. They had engineers working on that technology from different parts of the world, from the Bahamas, from Argentina, from Spain, from San Francisco. The engineers had put together some outstanding work, but they were struggling with defining their work for their audience. The business development team was struggling in engaging customers. They brought me in and said, this is what we have on GitHub. What can you do with it? So what I did was I put myself in the shoes of a developer customer, and I started to use their APIs in the way that they would want them to be used. And I started to ask questions that got the entire product team and marketing and business development talking to each other. What I found was what the engineers thought would work was only what worked on their machines. Their machines are highly tailored. They have many kinds of custom settings and software and configurations on them. And when I said, okay, let me try that, and started downloading exactly what the customers would download, the engineers were very surprised at what I discovered. And by going through the pain that their customers would have experienced, I eliminated that pain in reality for their customers, and they started to engage. They are now on an exponential growth cycle. I'm only part of a team, but they needed that in order to engage their customers.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to skip number 3 because I think you just answered it. What is essential to your relationship with each new client?
I would say being part of the product team, that communication within the team so that I know what is changing, and I expect things to change very rapidly, especially in a disordered environment where people are trying to stand up a product. I also need to earn and retain trust. Why should I say that? I'm going to be sitting with an engineering team. I'm going to need them to let me into their source code and let me modify their source code comments. I'm going to need to be able to pick an engineer's brain for 15 minutes and 15 minutes only and get meaningful information out of that interview so that I can go and produce the documentation they need and get it right the first time. If I don't get it right the first time, I've wasted the engineer's time and I've wasted the company's money.
Great. In your view, can a tech writer without a development background write great API doc?
Absolutely not. There is no way that a busy engineering team has time to train a person without a computer science degree. That's just the reality of it. Engineers, at best, can speak to you in some version of English, which may or may not be their native language. They don't have a lot of time, and they expect you to finish their thoughts for them. That means that you need to be able to sit next to them and look at how they're coding and be able to replicate that and extend it and even create examples. They may say, here's an example. You can extend it, add on these other APIs, work out this use case for us. We haven't had time to finish this. They could say, well, let me show you how this works in Objective-C. We also support this on Java. Can you create something similar on Java? If you don't have that kind of development background, it's unrealistic to expect that you could train, for example, somebody with a master's degree in English and a very intelligent person, but otherwise non-technical, to do such a thing.
Great. Do you want to field questions from the audience?
Yeah, we can have an open discussion. So lunch will be served in 5 minutes, so we're not late. I may open the first one. Just one thing. When I discovered the tech writer community, I've seen that there is really, between the API community and tech writer community, there is a small gap, but like there is a big opportunity to merge. But I've seen that they are mostly older people. When I say older, they are not millennials, right? Sorry for that. But they are not millennials. And when it's true that I have a startup in Silicon Valley, when someone show me a tech writer, which is like 50, 55 years old or older sometimes, because this community is, this is the average you told me around. Like I can be surprised about like, these guys don't really know, is this guy or this woman knows like Node.js and Go and this last framework and Swagger and Blueprint and whatever. And I was surprised. I was surprised at how fast they can learn sometimes. So, but how do you manage that cultural issue or whatever with when you talk to companies?
It's in the trenches. I can make promises all day long. Use the acid test. I'll let them say that ageism is not a problem when you're technical.
Yeah.
No. The fact is that deeply technical API writers are at a premium. They're very hard to find. Age is not the issue. What is the issue is a business solution, a solution that helps a product team support their product, that reduces support call volume, that increases scalability, increases adoption. It's true that I began programming in the 1970s with Fortran punch cards, and it's also true that I learned probably 20, 25 programming languages throughout my lifetime. But that is what I would consider an asset. A good technical writer, whether they're API focused or maybe not API focused, loves to learn. What I noticed as a programmer, and I spent 20 years employed as a programmer, was that I became highly specialized, and I ended up in a corner debugging small pieces of a code project, and I would be buttonholed there, and I couldn't escape. I wanted to see a larger project. I wanted to understand the larger solution, and it was very rare that I had the chance to do that. As a tech writer, it's the complete opposite. We drink from the fire hose. So we not only love to learn, but we have to be good at it. And one of the things we love to do is to see a new language and learn that language quite quickly.
We have time for one more questions. Yeah. Here. Oh, two. Okay, let's go for two.
You sort of touched on a lot of Silicon Valley startup, and I get how companies there want APIs, and I completely get that. But I suspect a lot of us in this room are from much larger beasts, like Fidelity and what have you. Now, how do you see companies like that engaging with you guys? You've clearly touched a lot on the Silicon Valley startup side of things, but at what point are companies like mine seeing the benefits of what you're describing?
We don't just do startups, but so James has worked in the financial space for Visa, for PayPal, for companies with up to 450,000 employees that ostensibly are organized and cautious and not where it's not frontiersville. And the same rules apply. If you can provide value, if you can get in there and make the decision makers in particular look good. In mature companies, they're realizing it a little sooner because it's an established checklist item. They don't know how to do it any better than the startups. That would be a lie. Nor do they necessarily have much more respect for the role, but they know who to call more frequently, and they have checks and balances in place. So I'm going to pass the mic to James because I know he has lots to add.
There are several experiences I've had in very, very large companies. I'll cite one instance. I had a 3-year engagement at Cisco. And what I noticed from strategic management decisions was that certain areas that Cisco was building were looked upon as startup companies within Cisco. And there was chaos, there was disorder, and things had to be stood up so that a more stable documentation team could eventually take it over. And they do have their own internal documentation team. But what they didn't have was that specialized expertise in developer-focused documentation. So they brought in me and a few other people, and we worked on this thing for 3 years and then handed it off, finally. I had that experience at HP as well. What we look at with some of the larger companies, we get to also work on the internal documentation. Again, the key is to get the people on the team talking to each other in ways that they might not have thought of before. Internal documentation is often a need at very large companies because you have teams that may be very, very large and scattered internationally that do not exactly understand what everyone is doing. This is an essential piece for coordinating development efforts.
One last question here.
Yeah, I wonder if you could tell us some of the biggest pitfalls to avoid, what you would consider bad API documentation.
Oh, sorry. If you answer fast, we can have this lady who asked a question earlier.
Okay, so when an engineer looks at documentation, the first thing they want to find out is where is the information I need? It could be, how do I get started? Or it could be, I already know how to get started with this. Where is this one feature that I want to learn how to work with? They should be able to find that within seconds. I have seen documentation that is disorganized, scattered, has thousands of pages in it, and relies on a glorified search mechanism. This is very, very frustrating to engineers who don't have that kind of time to be searching for information. Also, the writing style needs to be direct, friendly, and terse. Nice set of commands. Do this, do that, do this. For what I've been hearing about the banking industry, detail is absolutely critical. That detail needs to be complete, organized, laid out, and easy to parse. So that, again, the engineers who have to put this into practice will find it, understand it, and be able to use it very quickly, very easily, without too much annoyance.
Yeah, hi, good morning, everybody. Just want to, I'm here, second row, yeah. Just wanted to ask, how do you ensure that the documentation is up to date? Because many times I see that the documentation is correct for a particular version, but then as we move forward, we lose the relevance.
Okay, I'm going to pass that back to James because he has more current practitioner experience.
So that's, there are a number of ways in which that happens. Documentation efforts should be aligned with product release cycles. And one thing that I've noticed is that if you're embedded as a documentation person with an engineering team or a product team, then part of, for example, in an agile environment, the definition of done is that for a given feature, the docs for that feature have been validated and are correct. That engineering feature cannot get to done, cannot be marked as complete, and cannot be released until that happens. So that's a part of the discipline that helps ensure that. Another thing is single sourcing information. For API reference information that gets auto-generated, the ideal scenario is you have a competent tech writer who is allowed into the source code comments and will never break a build. That's another reason why you want somebody who's familiar with the development. When that happens, the engineers and the writers see the same information in the same place, only one place. And that way all eyes are on it, so that if it becomes outdated, it will be caught immediately.